Alright, kind of a overview video of sorts. Just going through the basic fundamental elemental functions of my the only one field theory. I guess it's new title. Just to see if we can get any kind of agreement that this is a feasible explanation. Simple rules, simple functions, doesn't require any bending of a non-existent space dimension thing. No virtual photons, no dualities about waves and particles, no lack of energy, movement without an explanation for how it happens, no spooky actions, just a basic simple force universe where something hits something and that's what causes it to do what it does. So it starts off the story with just something very simple, little bits of energy, all the same size, all the same momentum, moving the speed of light in random directions in the universe. Something very much like the cosmic background radiation, except not at any specific frequency. So it doesn't have a consistent polarization or frequency, so we don't see it as common radiation, but it's out there. And there's a ton of it, a lot of it. And it comes in two forms, north-south, positive, negative, electron force, proton force. However you want to distinguish it, there's two specific kinds and they're equally distributed. There's the same amount of little black arrows and little red arrows, if it is appropriate to metaphor it that way. It makes it easier to understand. So the black would represent force that was relevant to electrons, and the red would represent force that was relevant to protons. And the electrons and the protons in this theory are the only two elemental forms of matter. The neutron is basically a proton and an electron close together, and so it's not elemental, but the proton and electron can be subdivided, but that's breaking them. They don't work that way. They don't function that way. So the rest of all the particles that the particle zoo that conventional physics has described, these pieces may exist as some form of reality for brief milliseconds, but they're no more relevant to this story than, say, you seeing somebody's old flat tire on the side of the road, or an old car wreck or something. It's not how the cars really function. It's not how highways work. It's not how the universe functions. It's not dependent on those little pieces flying off. It's sort of dependent on them being part of electrons and protons. So anyway, so we just have this force. Again, it's one force. And all you can do is sort of change the fact that it's random. It comes into material circumstances as a random force, and the matter changes that randomness. It reflects it unevenly. It transmits it unevenly. And through that process, all the complexity in the universe can be explained. So let's put a piece of matter in the field. So this we will say is an electron, but it could be a proton, and you could just reverse the colors and you'd get the same effect, the same idea. So basically you have this field of force that's always hitting electrons, and the force can be in the form of light or photons or electromagnetic radiation, and the only difference is that that's these little black bits coming at a frequency, like bullets at a frequency. So if they're coming at a constant frequency, we call it light. But otherwise it's gravity, and when you segregate it based on its red or black, then it's what we call charge or magnetism. But anyway, the basic idea is the force comes in, and the black stuff all just reflects and creates a little bit of momentum in the electron. So it's coming from all directions and even. So if it was a electron in the universe, it would just see this force and be reflecting it back evenly, and just as if it went through it. So the universe doesn't really change if there's just one electron in it. The other thing that happens, well, you can sort of understand that electron will be pushed this way, it'll be pushed in every direction, but every direction equally, so it'll end up just staying in the same place. So it jitters and shudders, but it doesn't go anywhere because there's an equal amount of energy. The other trick is when the red force, the proton force, hits an electron, it leaves in one of the perpendicular dimensions. So it either leaves this way, out, or in. And it does that by basically exchanging with another red force its momentum. But the important factor is that in certain circumstances this allows unevennesses, that is, once the field is changed, to be redirected. And so it's an important fact, so it needs to be mentioned here, even though it's not obviously significant, in the sense that you can sort of understand that if you bend all of these to a different dimension, it'll end up just being the same thing. So this one won't go straight this way, it'll go this way, but there'll be another one that goes in this way that ends up going the way that other one went. So in a sense, this produces the same universe in terms of what it excretes. So what goes in essentially comes out, but it's only in an essentially sense, and that can be demonstrated when you start putting more than one element in the universe. So if there were 2 electrons in this field, something different is going to happen based on that reflection rule. And what's going to be different is that any of the energy that was trapped between them, so any of the radiation that was coming out of them towards the other object, will end up just constantly reflecting between the 2 objects. So if their distance, or what you might call their frequency, is less than the average frequency of the force coming in, this pressure you can sort of imagine as the 2 objects get closer and closer, like 2 ping pong paddles with a ping pong ball bouncing between them. You can sort of understand that the number of impacts on the paddles will increase as I push them together. So you have to understand the force is always the speed of light, and so you can kind of understand that at the speed of light, as that distance narrows, the amount of force increases rather dramatically, and so you end up with you need a little bit of technical difficulty just to make it all, just to make it one of my videos. Anyway, so that would end up creating not low pressure, high pressure, high pressure, and so that creates a strong force in this opposite direction that overcomes the field energy. So you can sort of understand the closer they're put together, the more pressure that they would be experiencing between them, in the sense they're getting more impacts on the interior than they're getting impacts on the exterior reflections. Now the red force will be doing something also in this context, in that any red force that goes between the 2 objects can't possibly get caught up in reflections, because it'll keep leaking out of these perpendicular directions. So any red force between them would just keep leaking out and there'll be no reflections. But the other side to that is any red force coming in from the field can also end up getting fed back in, and fed back out, but there'll be no constant reflections. So the force from the reds will end up balancing out essentially, or might have some effect. So it's a subtle effect. From a long distance away, the electrons probably feel nothing in terms of no real strong influence, nothing to overcome the external pressure. But the closer they get, the more significant the force becomes, and the higher the pressure between them. And that's a fundamental, very important thing, the idea of creating pressure. And you can sort of understand that the universe is sort of made out of that all the atoms are compressed, have a lot of pressure inside of them. That's why you can make a nuclear bomb, is because there's a lot of trapped, suppressed energy. Trapped is the key word. So anyway, so if you were to put, you could, just to understand, if there was an electron and a proton in association, the effects will be as demonstrated. So red force between the two objects would, that's not red. Yeah, it's the wrong color. All right, red force between them would end up leaking, you can sort of understand, out of the electron, and any black force that was going in, it goes out the proton in one of the perpendicular dimensions. So you can't trap anything between them, so you end up with very low pressure, and you end up with attraction. So now the external field will be more significant in its influence than the internal pressure, and the two objects will appear to be attracted when they're really just being pushed together. But so this gives you the capacity to make the standard atom. If I was just to do a crude drawing of an atom, you have a few of these protons in the middle, but they're very distant from the electrons, so their individual effect, you can sort of understand with distance, this force gets weaker. So from a long distance, this 10 neutrons could appear to this electron as just one proton very close. So you can sort of think of the further away they go, the more there has to be in the nucleus to hold the electron. But the closer they are, the fewer the electron needs to hold it together. So basically, you could argue the more protons in the center or in the nucleus, the further the range of the orbitals for the electrons. And I would argue that basically this is the idea would be is that you could hold each electron is just seeing the proton individually. They're not sharing the force in any way, so they don't. You could put as many as you want in here, and the same nucleus could hold all of them equally well. But the key factor you could understand is that there's repulsive pressure between the electrons, and each electron is attracted to the center. So there's a tension in the atom that's basically made out of the repulsive force pushing them apart and this force pushing them in. You can sort of understand, if I try to push this electron in, these other electrons that are being repelled are not going to like that. They're going to increase the pressure. So anytime you push on an electron, you're essentially pushing on all the other electrons, and they're going to essentially push back as you increase pressure. So you have to get over a threshold pressure to actually push an electron into this neutron space and have it either absorbed or ejected by the nucleus, depending on the circumstance. But I just want you to get the idea that this is all about, high pressure and then having low pressure on this inside, and you can understand that those are key ingredients to holding an atom together, or holding magnets in positions, is a balance between the attractive force and the repulsive force. Again, the attractive force is really not an attractive force, it's just the absence of pressure, which means the default pressure will push you together. Alright, so I don't think I need to make it to go any steps further than that, just to get the idea that that's the simple function. So nothing complicated, no spooky action, no complex wave functions, no any of that stuff. It's just basically a tension argument. Because you can regulate the amount of pressure there is, you can create circumstances where things are in tension, and by having force trapped between elemental bits, that trap is essentially an absorption of energy that now can't get into the field. So anytime the two electrons exist in an atom bound to each other, they're essentially trapping a piece of the universe, a piece of this field energy, and that field energy had a direction and had a momentum, and that momentum is now not in the field. So in that way, everything can affect everything in very subtle but real ways, just as a photon can travel across the whole universe and hit something billions of years away. So tiny effects, tiny events can affect the universe in major ways. So anyway, that's it. Just simple rules regarding how energy moves through the system. What reflects and what is pushed out. And you could sort of also, just to point out this reflection argument again. So the key here is this one, these charged elements, these are essentially charged, you could say. So the electron would be negative charge, and the proton would be positive charge. And what you're really seeing is why charges work, is that when an object is charged, it's going to reflect energy. And so when another object of the same charge is brought into proximity to that object, they're going to end up reflecting energy, just like two electrons, and they're going to create repulsion. And when the opposite charges are face each other, they're going to do the same thing the electron and the proton do, which is that they're going to lose each other's pressure, vulnerability, and there's going to be created a low pressure between them. Alright, so I think that's it for the drawings. I do have some of this in crude writing, and so we'll go over some of that, but some of the subjects are more detailed, so I don't want to get into too many details. I just want to get some recognition that this theory is not complicated, and it does not, in its elemental description. Obviously, all the phenomenon we see in the universe is complex. A human being is complex. Lots of stuff going on. My point is this simple mechanism explains the foundation of that complexity, why it's possible. So just like the DNA molecule provides you a way of understanding how you can have a long history of change in evolution, and that we would all retain some pieces of our past and pieces of what has been learned by our ancestors, you could say. That's the same point. This is the chromosome, this is the DNA that makes complexity possible. Regulating pressure is what makes complexity possible. So let's pop to the other word stuff. So, the only one field theory. Yes. Okay, anyway. Reflection and redirection can filter force. So as I just pointed out, clearly you can change where force is going by trapping it, essentially, but it's a filter. And the redirection, obviously, can substantially change how the universe is affected, in the sense that a force could be strongly going in one direction, and through this redirection just end up being spread in 2 or 3 or 4 directions, or it can be just diverted in one direction depending on the circumstance of how the little elemental bits are moving. So it's a simple filter, but it can do more than one thing in terms of how it's filtering. Alright, if you change what is filtered, you change the field. So the field of force. So every time they say the word field, you have to just think, alright, it's only the one field, and all you're doing is changing how much black arrows versus red arrows there are in a particular direction, or whether some of them are coming at a specific frequency. So you're really just changing the proportion of red to black, or the fact that some might be moving at a frequency. The frequency is caused by the pressure between the electrons. As you increase or decrease the pressure, you create tension that is equal to frequency. So the amount of tension the trampoline has will decide when something hits it, how fast it rebounds, and at what stage in its incursion it rebounds, which changes its frequency. So you can throw baseballs or something at a trampoline at a certain frequency, and they'll be, depending on the tension of the trampoline or the rebounder, they'll return at a different frequency. All right. Absorption and reflection versus absorption and redirection versus reflection. So reflection causes momentum, a little bit of movement in the little bit, but absorption and redirection, that is this stuff, doesn't cost anything, because technically it's just two force bits hitting each other inside. See, in the field, the force bits never hit each other. They're, whatever the reason is, or they hit each other and it doesn't matter, like two kinetic balls hitting each other head on. You really can't tell if they hit each other or they miss each other. The universe looks exactly the same. So it doesn't create a significant difference unless they are of different colors. But the key point is inside the matter bit, when the opposite polarity hits the opposite polarity matter bit, so when the opposite force bit hits the opposite polarity matter bit, the force is redirected, but the redirection is essentially an exchange of directions between two bits. But I don't want to get into that complexity. Change in frequency is just really a reference to the fact that you change the tension, you change the frequency. You change how much pressure is in an atom, you change the frequency of how it's going to react. It's going to react quicker and create a more... you can't change the speed of the force, but you can change the distance between the force bits. And atoms do that. We see it all the time. That's why they absorb different colors. Different materials absorb different colors, because the atoms, the orbits, are at different tensions. All right, change needs something to reflect to, charge. So it's a key point that without something else, if the one electron is in the universe, you can't tell its charge, because it's producing an equal amount of energy in all directions. And it's only when you put something else reflective, then you start to see what its charge is. So it's an interesting fact that you really can't see charge until you look at it with a charge. Just as you can't see a magnet, essentially. You can't see magnetism unless you use a magnet to see it. Alright, reflections between like matter bits amplifies the frequency of the force interaction, so that's just the stuff between. Magnifies force, so it's just a way of increasing energy by proximity. So you increase the energy between something, you trap it, and so you haven't really created energy. You have to sort of understand that by trapping energy, you increase its potential to, there's no increase in potential. Wrong way to say it. It's the ping pong paddle argument. You can just get it. The ping pong paddles brought closer together create more energy. But the fact is, to get the paddles closer together, you have to put energy in to the paddles. So something had to push the paddles together to create the higher pressure. That's why atoms had to be created inside of suns or high pressure areas, because they're pressurized. So they had the energy that's in the atom had to be pushed into it. It didn't come from nowhere. It's a theft from the field, so to speak, a trapping of energy, and it had to be trapped through pressure. All right, trapping is absorption, just sort of making the point that these words we use, you have to kind of qualify them and understand that the absorption is essentially keeping the force, keeping the momentum for some amount of time. And if you hold the momentum, it's likely to have an effect on where you're going to end up being in the future. It's likely to move you. Movement of matter equals trapping momentum force. So matter moves because it has the force to do so. Something has to keep pushing it. So when something flies through space, it's not just freely saying, I am like a photon, I just go forever. there's actually an engine inside of it that just keeps pushing it. And the engine is made out of the fact that the reflective force creates movement in the electron, but the diverting force, the mechanism that diverts energy, doesn't require energy because it's two things banging off of each other. So the matter bit doesn't have to absorb any of that energy or momentum. It just allows the process to take place, and therefore you can create a mechanism inside of matter that essentially will take advantage of that right turn and kind of force energy to keep pushing in one direction. That's a complex, that's the drag argument for people who are more knowledgeable on this subject about particle theories, and it's the way the drag argument becomes moot. Alright, freeing energy equals lowering pressure. So as the pressure is your lower pressure, the obvious argument is that energy is being more liberated. But in a sense, when two electrons move apart from each other, the energy is still trapped, so they haven't technically lowered the pressure of the universe, but their movement away from each other is essentially a liberation. Okay, charge ions only exist on surfaces. So this is sort of an argument about the difference between magnetism and charge, and it's the same effect. The charged object changes the field, the one field. It changes the amount of red and black, and the magnet does the same thing. It's just they're doing it in two different ways, and one's doing it as monopoles and the other's doing it as dipoles. That is, a proton electron, and the other one's doing it electron electron electron. Quite different, but the same facts exist. It's one field. There's no electric field and then a magnetic field. There's just one field, and two different kinds of functions affect that field. That is a charge function, where a bunch of ions on the surface of a material go black, so to speak, and make something very reflective to the black energy, or red. And the other one being where magnets, as I'll finish up here, magnetism is the byproduct of interior atoms creating dipoles of charge in alignment. So magnetism is a byproduct of the entire substance being used to redirect energy, where charge is entirely the reflective argument. So reflection is the key to how charge functions and makes things attract and repel, where redirection is the key to how a magnet creates the same kind of phenomenon, just a different manifestation of a change in the pressure, a change in the composition of the field. So that's what I've gotten written so far, and so we'll see how it goes. So I think that's enough of an outline of just what parts are elemental. These are the ones you can't break. You don't need to break. These are the checkers and the checkerboard. And I've given you the simple rules of how you play checkers, and the rest of the complexity just has to do with arranging these little bits over billions of years into pressurized tension relationships that cause all kinds of flows and traps of all kinds of size. The simplest trap is the electron trap, the ping pong paddle. The thing goes back and forth forever, theoretically. It's possible. For billions of years, the same force can just be bouncing between two electrons. But the traps can get much more complicated in that the force can go this into squares, and it can go into all kinds of shapes where it's still a trap. It's just not a back and forth trap. And that's what complexity is just a reflection of very complex traps, of flows of force and energy. Force that is energy in the one field, okay, that the matter bits float around in. All right, so that should be enough, I think, for this edition. Keep it simple. I don't think I'm asking too much for people to accept this versus in terms of creating any phenomenon versus the creation of a bent space medium, time dimensions, virtual photons as an acceptable concept, dualities where things are both matter and waves. So anyone who says that can't be, the universe can't do that, well, if the universe can do all that other stuff, it can do this. Because this is really simple. All right, so until the next time, next edition, where I get into more details about how charge, electricity, and magnetism and gravity actually function.